Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted to welcome tonight to Jewish Book Week Rod Liddle, author, journalist and broadcaster, who will be in conversation with Douglas Murray on his new book, The Strange Death of Europe. Welcome, Douglas and Rod. Thank you.
Hello, thanks a lot for coming. Thank you very much indeed for turning out tonight. And an enormous thanks as well to the organisers for giving me the honour and privilege of addressing the Jewish Book Week. Since being a young man, I have had only two real ambitions in my life. One was to turn a lesbian. The other was to become Jewish. I am now nearly 58, and I've messed up on both of those. There are some women I've been with who have subsequently made a journey in the other direction. But I think, at least with the Jewish Book Week, that this gets me about 25% of the way there already. You see, I'm getting the lingo, you see. In fact, one of the happiest moments of my youth was actually being accosted in the street by people from an organisation called Jews for Jesus, who actually did think I was Jewish. I told them to get thee hence. This evening is about Douglas Murray, though, and we will be discussing Douglas's latest book, his fourth, The Strange, The Strange Death of Europe: Immigration, Identity, and Islam. Douglas is either one of the country's most fearless and least credulous journalists, or a hate preacher of a similar kind to Anjem Choudary. Now, I tend to the former opinion, as does my wife, who delights in telling me that he is her favourite writer, and that she always turns to Douglas's column before she reads mine. So, as you can imagine, I also feel a great deal of personal warmth towards Murray. The business about hate preachers, and Anjem Choudary, incidentally, came from the Muslim Council of Britain, by the way. Douglas, of course, has been called a lot worse on many, many occasions. Whatever your opinion of the man, this book, his writings in general, and his work at the Henry Jackson Society have always challenged the easy and convenient liberal consensus on how we should deal with, firstly, immigration, but particularly Islamic immigration. He writes with enormous wit and from the basis of meticulous research. He is also a friend, so let's meet him. Douglas Murray. Well, welcome, Douglas. The Strange Death of Europe. How did you come to write this? It's got a slightly Cassandra-ish title, if I may say so. We're still here, are we not?
Sure. For now. It's really the result of a lot of things. First of all, it's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you all for coming. It's the result of lots of things, one of which was a set of things that happened in 2015, which is the core of the book, which was when famously Angela Merkel on the last day of August announced that normal border procedures would no longer occur in Germany, and that effectively anyone who came in could come, anyone who tried could come. And I was covering a bit of this as a journalist. I was going to the reception islands, as they became known, the Italian and the Greek islands, and I was seeing the people coming in straight off the boats.
Why? Was that a hobby? Or what were you doing that for? Was this with a view to writing the book?
No, first of all, it was just to write articles about it. And then I thought, this is so strange, because it seemed to me that it was a speeding up of a process that had been going on for decades, but a speeding up to such a degree that if you saw it firsthand, you had different views from if you didn't see it firsthand. It was very easy on an island like Lampedusa, which is equidistant between the nearest Italian island of Sicily and the North African coastline. very easy to see people coming in, dream of these people being dispersed around Europe and so on. Then you go to, as I did, the towns and places these people end up in, speak to them when they're living outside the train station in Milan, or working for a gang in the marketplace in Rome, or in suburbs of Swedish towns. And I came to the conclusion that what we were doing was suicidal. And we were not asking any of the questions we should have been asking.
But hang on, you say suicidal, we'll come to that. At first it sounds like you're motivated by compassion for the people who were coming here.
Yeah, I spoke to a very large number of people from all over the world.
Where largely were they from?
Well, as the EU now admits, the Frontex figures admit, most of them don't come from Syria. Most, by 2015, were coming from sub-Saharan Africa. But I spoke to people from Myanmar, from many people from Pakistan, a young man from Bangladesh who features in the book who had spent $15,000. His father's a bank manager in Bangladesh. He'd spent $15,000 to get to the Greek islands, where he was then trapped when I saw him, because they weren't allowing people off the islands then to Athens. It was very easy. This is the point, really, is that it was very easy in the media, in particular, and in government to some extent, to say, let them come. It's so easy at a distance. And yet we weren't asking any of the questions. And one of the questions I boiled it down to was this: can Europe be the home for anyone in the world who wants to move in and call it home? This is a very, very difficult question. And if the answer is no, as most people I think, then the questions have to start from there. So who is it for? And is there a moment when it's too much?
Of course, the No Borders people would say that, yes, it can be a home for everybody in the world.
Yeah.
Even if the practicalities of that somewhat desert them and they don't get it. But nonetheless,
yes,
the moral imperative is that the border should be totally open. There are plenty on the left,
yes,
who would argue that, and indeed on the libertarian right.
Oh, yeah. Yes, there are a lot of people who argue that. And they are very rarely taken to task for the consequences of their view. Often they don't experience the consequences themselves. Although I give a set of examples in this of people in the Open Borders movement who actually did suffer the consequences. And there are some amazing stories of that, which I describe firsthand. But the crucial thing is, I say, in that 1 year alone, Germany added 2% to its population. Sweden in 2015 added 3% to its population. These are vast numbers to take in. And I know what people say. They say, well, you know, they'll move in, they'll become like us and so on. And of course some will, but a lot won't. And the question of speed and where people come from has to be thought about, certainly at a deeper issue, and at a deeper level than at the level of, I want to feel good about myself, so I'll make somebody else do something generous on my behalf.
Well, indeed, on that particular issue, it's a little like those who argued a couple of years ago, and I remember having an argument with Simon Sharma about this on Question Time, which is that we must do more without actually spelling out what the more would be, and also encouraging more people to come here.
Yes.
And when it's pointed out that more people will die as a consequence of coming here, this is brushed aside.
Yes.
It's,
yes, they always deny that there's a draw. They always deny the draw. The NGOs deny it, others deny it. Since I wrote the book, there's a paperback coming out later in the year, but I mentioned that some of the NGOs have been caught doing something which I thought they were doing, which was cooperating with the smuggling gangs.
Yeah.
The Italian police and others discovered this just a couple of months ago.
because they follow the No Borders ideology.
So what happens is, over the recent years that I describe in the book, the migrant gangs, which, it's disgusting what they do. It's just unbelievable. And the treatment of the people who pay the money to get them into Europe is just unimaginable to most of us. I spoke to somebody who was in one of the houses. They kept people in Libya, and he'd run out of money, and they tortured him and videoed it on his own mobile phone and sent it back to his family to get more money out of them. So these gangs are really wicked, and and it's a few $1,000 or euros to cross the Mediterranean. One of the things that people have to think about. The NGOs say that they are saving people from the Mediterranean. They were caught not only having contact with the gangs, the gangs would tell them when they were setting off a boat and where to pick it up, but then giving the boats back to the gangs. You know, by 2016, the boats didn't have to go more than a few miles off the North African coastline because they were picked up by the European border agencies and by NGO vessels. So the smuggling gangs by then saved money on the petrol. They wouldn't even bother to fill the tanks up halfway, and they'd send out more and more unseaworthy vessels. On which, again, I mean, anyone who cares about the details of it, there were boats there was a boat I saw come in Lampedusa where there were a group of Eritreans who were sitting in the bottom of the boat, and they told me that they were in the hold of the boat downstairs. Those were the cheap seats, and they were the cheap seats because it was regarded that they had cheap lives. And if the boats went down, the slightly better off people from other bits of the world would possibly survive, but they, the Eritreans, would go down. This is just unimaginable horror, and something which we have to, as I say, think about.
And at the time, of course, and still, people referring to these people as refugees.
Yes.
As if they were fleeing a war zone, when in the majority of cases they most certainly weren't.
Yes.
They were economic refugees. And if I remember rightly, one of the charities which was dealing with, an Islamic charity which was dealing with the people at Sangatte, yes, went down there to Sangatte and immediately pulled its people out and said, there are no refugees.
Yes.
They are all economic migrants.
By 2016, Frans Timmermans, the Vice President of the European Commission, admitted that by Frontex's own figures, at least 60% of the people who came in 2015 had, quote, no more right to be in Europe than anyone else in the world. And here's the difficult bit, among others. I think we all recognize that there are people who are fleeing actual horrors, real horrors, like the Syrian civil war. And we have to have an attitude towards what we do with those people on a temporary basis, on a permanent basis, whatever it is. This country, by the way, I mean, we're the second biggest aid giver to the camps in Lebanon and Turkey and Jordan and so on. And
Italy.
Yes. And it costs 100 times more to house a migrant in, for instance, Sweden, than it does to look after them in one of those places. So the economics for not saying...
But you're not, with respect, you're not looking after them in those camps.
No.
You're giving them a temporary place to stay.
Yeah.
I mean, it is not the same as having a new life, which is what they want.
Right, exactly. And the follow-on is this very strange game that is played by the Open Borders activists, which is, well, what's the difference between somebody fleeing socioeconomic hardship and somebody fleeing the Syrian civil war? I think a lot of difference myself.
Name it. Define it.
Well, so, one of the views I came to when writing this book was that if you believe in asylum, even the asylum issue has to be thought about more. Who is it that deserves asylum in Europe? I would say that it's people for whom only Europe could be the place that they could live, because outside of Europe they would surely die.
Why?
That is, well,
Why?
I give the example, for instance, of Yazidis. If you were a Yazidi in 2014, and the situation hadn't have been turned around slightly as it was, then I think Europe could have legitimately said, look, if there's nowhere in the Middle East for the Yazidis and they are going to be wiped out as a people because that is the aim of ISIS, then that is a legitimate asylum claim. But the idea that, I mean, as I say, now, as last year, as this year, as today, the movement into the Italian islands is entirely from sub-Saharan Africa. I don't doubt, believe me from speaking to a lot of people from there, I don't doubt for a moment that what they're fleeing is terrible. But can Europe become the home of people who are fleeing penury and low living standards there? I think it can't be. Or to put it another way, one point I make toward the end of the book is, what if the situation that we are in Europe is not that we are this endlessly open place where we can bring people in and we're like a sort of sausage machine, whatever you put in, it always tastes the same, people will come and they'll just end up being European by breathing the air of Europe. What if actually what it is that this is a kind of lifeboat itself, this continent of ours, and that we are in the situation of a lifeboat going through waters with people all around us asking to come onto the boat. And we want to bring people on board, and we can bring some people on board. The point is that it's not limitless, because there must be a point at which you capsize the only vessel you have. And this is very difficult, as we all know, because we don't have a
Forgive
thing.
me, we're a long way from that, aren't we?
Well, let's look at, some of the stats I give in the book for that, and some of the things I've seen across Europe. We're not that far away on some of it. Go to Paris. Okay, take a Parisian suburbs at the moment. Last year in Paris, I was there again after the book. There are people just living on the side of the roads in massive encampments. In like the Stalingrad area. This is not the furthest away banlieue. This is not Saint-Denis even. And of course, nobody cares about this bit. Just like they don't care about the towns across Scandinavian people. They don't go to them. It's worse than that. They laugh at the concerns of the people there. I was in DC until yesterday. I came back overnight. And I was reading the New York Times on the tube this morning. And I see that the New York Times has finally mentioned that the number of grenade attacks that are now happening in Stockholm. I remember even 18 months ago, and indeed when my book came out, the New York Times laughing at anyone who expressed concern about this. Oh, there are these weird people who think that there are suburbs of Stockholm that are unsafe. No, that's very serious. I've been to these places. I've seen it.
Well, and Malmo 10 times worse.
Malmo. People think it's some kind of far-right, alt-right, imaginary. No, 4 years ago in Malmo, locals had to do walk a Jew to work day.
Yeah.
Okay? Yeah. They were walking Jews, the remaining Jews in Malmo. It used to have a thriving population. You can see how thriving it used to be from the cemetery, the Jewish cemetery there. And it's got about 800 Jews there now. Locals were walking the Jews to synagogue to make sure they weren't attacked. Now, in what world does that become normal or able to be laughed at? Or worse, this thing of we won't even look at it. We won't even ask where it's coming from.
And yet a lot of the animus against the Jewish population of Malmo was sanctioned effectively by the Social Democratic Party leaders of the white Social Democratic Christian Party leaders.
Yes. By the way, there's a brilliant young Kurdish demographer whose work I cite quite a bit in the book, who is in Sweden, and he alerted, his work alerted me to this extraordinary thing that it's now provable in Sweden that people's attitudes towards diversity, people are more in favour of the diversity after they have left a diverse area to move to a monocultural area.
Yes, indeed. Of course
Provable.
they are. Of course they are. Two things. Firstly, you're talking about the death of Europe, the strange death of Europe, the suicide of Europe. Are we talking simply about numbers?
No. It's two things.
Well, look, let's deal with the numbers first, because I'm not sure you're right. Mm-hmm. I mean, if you look at our country, and I've had it said to me many times when I write quite stridently against immigration.
I've noticed that.
Thank you. Because I think, largely from the left, that I think it undercuts the wages of the poorest of us, and it's a hugely exploited labour market.
Sure.
I cannot understand left-wing parties that go along with it. But it is nonetheless the case, as it's pointed out to me, that the numbers coming in, it's 250,000 a year. That will have ramifications. Of course, it has ramifications on our National Health Service and on our housing. But nonetheless, it is, compared to our general population, a small drop in the ocean.
But it's not. I say in the opening chapters, I give the example of Britain. Britain, of course, ducked the 2015 flow. We, I think, wisely said that we would give a small amount of a number of Syrian migrants.
The Syrian flow,
20,000. We actually haven't made anything like that so far, which I think is regrettable. But we ducked the 2015 flow. But look, we ducked that, but we had similar migrant rates to the rest of Europe in the decades preceding that. Now, again, near the start of the book, I give what I think should be regarded as being a very worrying analysis. If you take each country in Europe had somebody in it in the post-war period, from the Gastarbeiter, the guest worker period onwards, who expressed concern in some way, sometimes politely and pleasantly, sometimes not, about the migration that was already getting going from the 1950s onwards. And in each country, I go through them. There's obviously the case of Enoch Powell here, There's a case of somebody called Jean Raspail in France, and so on. In each of these cases, the numbers they talked about turned out to be wild underestimates of the numbers that ended up coming, even before the 2015 flow. So that, for instance, I mean, let's get into it. I think this, by the way, as I say, the two things that are most important are numbers and identity. But look at the...
We'll deal with numbers.
Okay, look at the numbers first. Look at this country. 2011, the census is carried out. A set of things have happened in the decade since the 2001 census. One is that the Muslim population has doubled in the UK, and one is that it is expected to double again.
Let me come in there, because that is a point. But when I was 16, 17 years old, I was a member of the Socialist Workers' Party. And I would say my father was disgusted, and I would say proudly to him, we're the fastest growing political party in Europe. Our membership doubled in the last month, and he quite rightly said, that's because there were only fucking 4 of you in it a month ago. And he had a point.
Sure.
And it is true as well. The Muslim population of this country is 4.5%.
Sure.
It is nothing.
And going to double in the next decade and double again.
It is 4.5%.
Sure, but
That's what it is.
This in itself has a whole set of ramifications. If Enoch Powell had said in 1968 that in 2016 the most popular name for boys in the UK would be Mohammed, you would have said, what are you doing?
It's actually second to James in the whole country.
No, if you add them up and you make
No,
sure
I
you use
have
every...
Well, we're going to differ about this.
If you use every spelling, because you remember they used to deliberately not
Muhammad.
use all the same. They used to say Muhammad was different from Muhammad and so on. But anyhow, let me give you another example. Then.
Yes, I mean,
the 2011
right, yes,
the 2011 census. There are 33 London boroughs. In 23 out of the 33 London boroughs, the census says that people who identify as white British, that's their identity, not mine, that white British are a minority in 23 out of 33 London boroughs. I go back to the point. If
And
Enoch
a
Powell,
very small minority in many of them.
exactly.
Yeah.
So I go back to the point. If Enoch Powell had said in 1968 that in 2011 people who were white British would be a minority in London, people would have said, what are you doing? What are you claiming? You're a madman.
But with, again,
this
Douglas, with respect, Enoch Powell was speaking at a time when we had, and he might now agree, dead though he is, probably...
Unarguably so.
Unarguably so. I will cite him.
Simon Hoggart, I think, used to say, use the word dead about people as an insult.
Yes, that's right.
The
Now
dead politician,
the dead
Enoch
politician.
Powell. Yeah. As if it was his fault.
But Powell was talking at a time when we'd had African-Caribbean immigration from the 50s, which had caused some problems.
Yeah.
There had been riots in Notting Hill, etc., and a great deal of racism as well attendant. But he was speaking particularly at a time when we had probably the most successful immigration this country has ever had, which was the immigration of Asian people from East Africa, from Kenya and Uganda. A hugely, with the exception, obviously, of Yasmin Alabaya Brown, a hugely successful.
Well,
so he didn't. None of the other stuff pertained.
What are the case of the Ugandan Asians is a very interesting one, not least because it was a one-off acceptance by this country. I think the right thing to do, obviously. But that one-off immigration, which is still talked about, by the era of the Blair government, was an average 6 weeks immigration. In other words, you were doing the Ugandan Asians immigration every 6 weeks. Now, again, I just think that for all sorts of reasons, some of which are perfectly legitimate, because there are some very unpleasant people out there are some legitimate reasons to be worried about this discussion, but there are also very, very many more reasons to be worried about it and to think about it at the very least. And here's another reason. We used to talk about this in terms of race. And then at some point I say it's in this country from the Satanic Verses affair onwards.
Sure.
In Holland, it's from the moment in 1990 when an imam on Dutch radio calls for the death of apostates.
Yeah.
Each country has a moment when it starts to think, maybe actually the racial element is not that important. Maybe it's about the ideologies.
Well, I wanted to come to that, yes, because that is basically what your book is about. That is the real worry for you. It's less the actual numerical swamping than the cultural swamping.
Sure. Yes, I mean, I think, again, this causes all sorts of problems to the left, and it's why I understand they want to shut it down. But take one...
and you're talking about, let's be clear, it's about Islam.
Yeah,
we're not worried
I think that's-
particularly about Buddhists coming here,
No,
are we? And
until such a
Hindu.
time as we had a serious problem with Buddhist extremism,
Yeah.
which can occur, of course, but
Well, of course, yes.
But of course it's that. I think I say in the book, it's the biggest values challenge, it's the most assertive, it's the most unapologetic. It's the only one that actually is willing to talk to people in the level of threat. I mean, what happens whenever you say anything about Islam or Muslim ideas? You're always told that you might be about to piss off 1.4 billion people. Okay.
Well,
imagine
you
if they can be right, absolutely. But imagine if how many Jews are there in the world? What, probably 11 million, something like that. Is it right? About that. Imagine if every time somebody said something that was mildly annoying to one Jewish person, they said, "You're about to piss off, 11 million people worldwide." You would say, "You don't talk to me in that tone of voice. I'm not having that." And yet this is the tone which we're now expecting to be talked to in.
Is
and
it?
Yes. And let me give you...
I say stuff about Islam every week.
Yeah, I know.
I couldn't give a toss what people say.
If I may say so, rather a rare breed in this regard, as in others. But I mean, here are the problems we're starting to walk into. Because nobody thought about this very deeply or very well, and because, as I say, for all sorts of reasons, we wanted to have a very limited discussion about it, things keep on happening which just seem to surprise people.
Like
for
what?
instance, look at all opinion polls, social attitude surveys and everything. What is one of the things of the left of which you used to be a part? What is one of the biggest things? Individual rights, minority rights, absolutely, it's a very important thing. Where do Muslim communities, even in a country like Britain, stand on some of these things? It's not good. It's not good at all. 2 years ago, a poll finds that among British Muslims, there is 52% of them want to make being gay illegal now. Okay. So what do you do? What gives in that situation? Do the gays give in something? Do they accept that there'll be a higher level of intolerance towards them? Or do we say, look, the Muslims are kind of 4 decades or 1,400 years or something behind the rest of us, so we'll just have to wait and at some point they'll catch up?
But two things. Firstly, they constitute 4.4% of the population. Secondly...
At the moment, yes.
Yeah, it's the Uncle Norman argument, and I would accept it described as that, but I have Muslim friends, not many. I grant you, not many. But I have Muslim friends, and they are impeccably liberal, more liberal than me on many social issues. Because I'm a social conservative, and there are things within Islam with which I think, the respect for the family, for example, and all that sort of, which I have some time for. You cannot, therefore, and this will be the complaint which is always levelled at you, and is levelled at you by the Muslim Council of Britain and others. You cannot castigate an entire group of people for the outrageous ideas of some of its members. And I know plenty of Christians who think similarly on the issue of gay rights.
Absolutely, and I acknowledge that. I'm talking about what the crocodiles are closest to the boat at the moment. And let me give another example. The most obvious one is a security concern. Okay, I'm not smearing an entire community by raising this. But last year, when there were 3 attacks, one after the other, in this country, when the attack in Westminster, that was a British-born convert to Islam. The second is of a young man whose parents were given asylum because they were fleeing Gaddafi, and he was a member, the father of a Libyan Islamic fighting group, which was a jihadist group that was falling out with Gaddafi. So we gave him asylum in the 90s. His son, at the age of 22, blows up 22 young girls for going to an Ariana Grande concert in Manchester one night. And a few weeks later, it's a group of people, to my mind, none of whom should have been in this country. One man from Pakistan who claimed asylum in the 90s, another man who came in some years ago who pretended to be from Libya, who was actually from Morocco, was of a different name, different age, lied about everything, stayed here. Then he slashes a load of people's throats while shouting, "This is for Allah," on a Saturday night on London Bridge. This is on my mind, and I think it's on a lot of people's minds. And I resent the accusation that if one says Should, for instance, those attackers, of course, what always happens after this is there's a bureaucratic political discussion. Theresa May says, we've got to look at what the tech companies can do to sort of, one of the London Bridge attackers was on a Channel 4 documentary a few years ago called My Brother the Jihadist. Okay. So actually all she needs to do is turn on the telly. This guy was advertising himself. And what we do is this bureaucratic one, and then now we have the weird, morose, don't look back in anger response to these things. And I think, along with a lot of the public, resent this claim.
Yeah, but
that this
what
stuff
are you
happens.
looking-
That this stuff happens, and that we never talk about whether the people should even have been here. What we did wrong in our immigration, asylum, and identity policies to mean that they were here. What the stages are that the whole game tilts. And this is an important point to make. In 2015, at the height of the migration crisis, in one night in Paris, 130 people are mown down with Kalashnikovs and blown up at a rock concert in the center of Paris. And the people who did it were French and Belgian born, but they had been going in and out of Europe using the migrant routes because they knew they could do it, and they were training in Syria to do this. Now, this is an interesting one. Angela Merkel, along with Juncker and others, remained quite quiet immediately after the Paris attacks. Why? Because they become aware of something which I am very, very worried about, which is that if we do not talk about this now, the whole thing can flip, and it flips in this way. So far, if you are one of the people in the political mainstream or in the journalistic mainstream who says, let them come, you've only got points to win. It's only you that looks good. What if at some point things like Paris in November 2015 become regular? And the public turn around to the politicians and say, you did this to us. You were so lax with our security, you didn't care about borders, you didn't care who was here, and now our children are dead.
Well,
what happens
okay.
then? And that's what the politicians should be thinking about, among other things.
Well, two things. Obviously, Europe's people seem to be taking that approach right now.
Yes.
Totally the vote in Italy was almost exclusively an anti-immigration vote. And then we have those countries in the centre of Europe, which are
Take a divergent view.
Take a divergent view, yes. From Austria, Hungary, the Czechia, Poland, and Slovakia. But I still come back to the essential point, which is that you can make those points. You can say, perhaps we did something wrong with our immigration policy. Perhaps fewer people should come in. Perhaps we should be more secure in the way we vet the people who do come in. But you don't then blame a religion for it.
No, I don't blame the whole religion. I do not blame the whole religion. What I say is that there's a terrible combination of two things going on. The first is the mass movement of people, which is unprecedented for our continent. I mean, just one other stat. The most important event in immigration in the last millennium for this country was the Norman invasion. The Norman invasion changed the population of this country by something like 4%. Okay, and we still talk about it. It's a big event in our history. So our memories of these things matter. But my point is that the amazing historic movement of people into our continent is combining with something else, which is something we should get onto, which is the other bit of this book, which is what my critics have totally ignored, which is that I say that the problem is that this is happening at precisely the moment that we in Europe have lost any idea of what we actually are for. And I think this is something we have to think about. There's a wonderful French philosopher called Chantal del Sol, who I quote in the book, who describes the situation of modern European man and womankind since as we'd say in Canada, since the fall of the Berlin Wall. She says that our situation is the situation that Icarus would have been in if he'd survived the fall.
Explain why.
Basically what's happened in Europe is that we have dreamt so many dreams that turned out to be nightmares. We had religious wars for centuries. We tore ourselves apart with religion. We had political visions. We had in the 20th century these two dreams that were nightmares. And at the end of this, after the second of them collapses, we're left in this position in Europe. We're left bruised, singed, burned, and yet alive. So what do? The only answer we say, basically, we could go on holiday, we can go shopping, we could have a discussion about British values and about tolerance and diversity could be the point.
Diversity, the most abused word in the English language, I think, by now, I would have thought. But,
Yeah.
along with vulnerable.
And vibrant, I
And
find.
vibrant.
Vibrant is...
If you ever hear that a community is vibrant, vulnerable and diverse, you just know it's criminal.
Yeah.
But there we are.
Run for the hills.
Run for the hills.
But this
you're
is
right.
a
It's also
serious
what,
challenge.
It's also speaking a while ago, while I was researching another piece, to the American sociologist Charles Murray.
Yes.
Who said that, who had laughed when I brought up Europe. He said, it's fantastic. This is an experiment that you are conducting,
Yes.
where you have done away with God,
Yes.
and thus you've done away with everything which holds your societies together,
Right.
and you haven't found anything to replace it
No, no, and we have this very, very poor, as I say, bureaucratic version of it, which says we will invent British values and that'll be the response. And I just think, I invite readers in this book to think deeper about this. And that's really, just to come back briefly to the Islam bit, that's why I'm worried about this, because I think a serious and robust, almost any serious and robust values challenge at this point in European history would have a very unusual advantage, because you are talking into a vacuum. And this applies obviously differently in different communities and in different religions, but this...
Well, you could say it's just a liberal secularism, couldn't you? You could say it's simply that. A humanism, a secularism, it's...
Absolutely, but here's something that is worth thinking about, and which I ponder in this book. What if this is a very unusual period to be in? What if the situation of liberal secular humanism turns out to be basically monogenerational? What if what we've enjoyed...
Oh, I do hope so.
But worry about what might come next. It seems already, and I'm sure there are a lot of people who recognize this, it seems from campuses and other things, you notice that actually perhaps the Enlightenment and the virtues of the Enlightenment and the values of the Enlightenment turned out not to have gone very deep or very wide. And they were held by a relatively small group of us in a relatively small continent with a relatively small number of people, and that it can change. And there's no reason that that's necessarily going to remain in place forever. It's not by act of God or man or government or bureaucracy that that's the case. It could all change. And this is why the Eastern European thing is so interesting to me. I traveled in Central and Eastern Europe a lot. And of course, their view on all of this is utterly different. They look at Western Europe and they say, we do not want to be like that. And I say at one point in the book, why is Eastern Europe different? And there's one thing in particular which I just wish people, instead of berating them as all being fascists and racists, just thought maybe they're onto something. And that's this. They remember several things. Not just going back some centuries to the Siege of Vienna and elsewhere, but they also remember the 20th century much better than other countries now do. And they remember that you don't get any time off from history, that you get utterly destroyed by one ideology. And before you've even come back above the surface to breathe, from another direction, it's all smashed up in an entirely different way. And so they know something
You think
which
that's the root
Yes,
of the
I think it's
the Central European
I think they
antipathy?
have one thing which we have lost sight of, which is to be careful with your future, to think about your future, to not do grand experiments on the public that have not been tried before. We're not a petri dish you can just experiment in, because, again, it's the only thing we have. There's a moment in a novel which many of you will have read. Michael Welbeck wrote this novel, Submission.
Wonderful novel.
It's a wonderful book, and at the end of this book, I write a bit about Welbeck. There's one line some of you will know from Submission, where the character who's a young Jewish girl is having an affair with her older non-Jewish professor, described in torrid and rather great detail.
It's Welbeck.
It's Welbeck. And there's a moment, some of you will remember in that novel, where she is set in a sort of France in the 2020s. She says to her lover that she's making Aliyah, she's going to Israel. And he says, I made the realization that I don't have an Israel. And I think this is something, again, people here have to think about. Most Europeans don't have
We
an
don't
Israel.
have an Israel.
We don't have another option on this.
No.
If we screw this up, we've screwed up the only thing we have. So why not think about this more deeply? Why not be careful with this?
Can I, before I hand over to the audience, because I'm sure there are a lot of people who want to ask you questions, I thoroughly enjoyed your book. I think it was a superb piece of work and needed to be said. My caveats were those which you have to do as devil's advocate, help us. But there is room for some degree of optimism, is there not? If you look at the voting patterns in Europe, in Italy, in Germany even, certainly in the Netherlands, and again in that tranche of Central European countries, which include Austria, which has its own very individual view of history,
Sure does.
for many, many different reasons, that people are turning against everything which Merkel and the rest had planned for us all.
Yes, but they may not listen to them. Every opinion poll for decades in Europe has shown the same thing, which is that people want the immigration to slow down at the very least. And if you look at every opinion poll in Europe and Western Europe, the public are asking the same thing all the time. And what do they get every time they vote? To say, slow it down. They get told they're fascists, they get told they're racists, they're xenophobes. What was the coverage of the Italian election in this country and in most of the international press? Fascism returns to Italy. If you had 35% youth unemployment in a country, and you've got 15% general unemployment, and you have hundreds of thousands of people landing on the shore all the time and fundamentally changing the society, can we not say to these people there is a legitimate way to say that we don't like this? Do they have to be either on board with the mass immigration of Merkel or they're Nazis? I think that we are creating this nightmare, which is that something so strange has happened. The publics, to take a boring right-left dichotomy, the publics keeps going to the right. And almost in response, the politicians run to the left. Why can't Merkel say, not that, instead of this new law they've just passed in Germany that makes hate speech online illegal, I mean, that's a great idea for Germany, isn't it? Why not massively change a society, do loads of things to the society and then make it illegal to object? Gosh, what could go wrong there? Instead of doing that, just recognise that the people who are worried are onto something.
But she has, hasn't she? She
No,
has
she
recognised
hasn't.
that.
Even her apologies, read the actual text of what she says. She never apologises for this. She says things like, I wish we'd been better prepared. Honestly, in 2010, she gives the Potsdam speech in which she says, multiculturalism since World War II has failed utterly. These are her words. She said, we thought the guest workers would go home and they didn't. What an error to have made. She says this in 2010, and then in 2015 she speeds the immigration up to a level it has never been at before. Why would you do that? Why would you not spend those 5 years trying to work to make it better? She never apologizes. It's a religion for her.
I'm going to open this up to the audience. I have very poor vision. I'm going to put my glasses on so that I can see who's asking the question in case I say, thank you, madam, a question from you, and it's the fucking chief rabbi, which I don't want to do. It's a problem. If you could put your hands up and wait for the microphone to arrive. I think we have people walking around with microphones. Do we? Hello? I still can't see. Yes. So questions to Douglas. Gentleman there, you're near the microphone.
Rod, you wrote a few months ago that you and Douglas Murray have a bet on to see who will be the first to be prosecuted for Islamophobia. How's that going? And are you and are you actually suggesting, as I suspect you are, that Islamophobia is a nonsense post-9/11 word?
I think Islamophobia doesn't exist. I think my worry about Islam is not irrational and illogical, but it's based in a worry about Islam. I think it's a ludicrous word. I also don't have much time for the word homophobia either. I think these are constructs which we have built around ourselves in the last 20 years because we don't have very much else to cling to. I don't know how I would have thought Douglas is probably nosing ahead in the old
But you've been doing sterling work.
I've been doing all right. I've been,
The real test on this one, if I can say so, is this. Are you willing in a public space to say something that is critical of the Jewish God? Are you willing in a public space to say something that is critical of the Christian God? Are you willing in a public space to say something that is critical of the Muslim God? No, it's only the third that gets the problem. It's only the third that everyone dodges. I refuse
which
to
is why
dodge that.
Islam exists, of course.
Yes, because
It is.
imagine the work we could do if we claimed that behind us were people with Kalashnikovs.
No, but in fairness, it is the other way around, isn't it? That the Christian Church, and particularly the Anglican Church, has sustained itself and continues to sustain itself, even with that man in charge of it at the moment, by adapting.
Yes.
And by adapting to whatever society's morals may change towards. Whereas Islam has managed to preserve itself by sticking to its word, you might argue.
Yes. You may well argue that. It works very well. The problem, to my mind, is this. I like Rod, I have a lot of colleagues and friends who are Muslim. They tend to be of the more liberal, reformist kind, you'll be unsurprised to hear. But here's the problem. Islam as a religion has all sorts of inherent inbuilt troubles, as every religion does. But we know the troubles in the religions that have been here. We're fairly aware of them. We know that if there's some crazy pastor, in America, he doesn't get any cover from the Christian churches. The Archbishop of Canterbury doesn't back some crazy pastor in, Wyoming. It just doesn't happen. Now, so here's the problem we have. What if the thing with Islam is it doesn't reform? It can't reform. That is a tragedy for my Muslims.
Or if its reform was 1979.
Yes, if ISIS and Khomeini is the reform.
Yes, that is the reform.
The Reformation is ISIS. So if that's the case, look, this is a horrible thing throughout Islamic history. The reformers always end up getting killed. That's a tragedy for Islam. That's a tragedy for my Muslim friends. I don't want it to be our tragedy as well. So it seems to me this is like being outside a pub at last orders, seeing two men in a fight, and then deciding to throw yourself into the middle of it and say, your fight is my fight.
That's happened to me quite a lot. Anyway, another question, please. If we can come down here. Oh, sorry. Gentleman at the back first, and then down here.
Hi, sorry, yeah. Fantastic book, by the way. I wanted to ask about... Sorry, I'm here. I wanted to ask about whether you had any ideas on the current Conservative Party and what they could do. I'm worried that they're moving quite far to the left, and not just Mrs May, but in the future, what kind of policies they could adopt.
Gosh, you're asking the wrong person, probably, because this book has nothing to do with, obviously, Brexit or anything like that that's going on. And I watch the Conservative Party, like all political parties here, with a mixture of awe and horror. As a floating voter, my own view is that in this country there's something very strange, which is the political class is entirely held hostage to the rhetoric and opinions of the far left. And whereas on the continent there's been enough flexibility within the political system to, for instance, throw up sometimes ugly anti-immigration parties, which then parts of the mainstream, as in Holland, pull in the respectable bit of it and keep out the unrespectable bit. In this country, we're sort of the most politically correct one of all in our politics. And whenever the Conservative Party does try to do anything in this, it marks it up with amazing skill in new ways you hadn't imagined.
It is remarkable the degree to which it's been captured by a liberal social agenda, just as Gramsci would have predicted.
Yes, but here's the thing, as both you and I know from television studios, they're basically in a situation, in Chekhov plays, it's always said that if there's a gun on stage, it's got to go off by the end. They're in this situation all the time, as you and I are. If I go into a studio, the Conservative Party have a representative in the studio, the gun is pointed in one direction and it's got to go off at some point. So what is the point of any MP appearing on any political opinion program these days? It's to survive. And to win is to be able to implausibly or otherwise accuse your opponent of either racism, fascism, xenophobia, misogyny, homophobia. You can see it in their eyes. They're just desperate for Rod or me to say something really racist. And we're not going to, because we're not. And they think the same thing with the Conservative Party. And if they can't get them to say anything racist, they want you to say something that they can claim is anti-women or anti-gay or something. It goes on and on and on. This is the political discussion we have in this country.
It is. It is. It is. It's terrifying, sorry. Yes, another question. Oh, sorry, sir, you next. Could we have some women or transgendered people asking questions?
Or somebody who's fluid would be good.
Or amputees. Sorry.
Yeah, we understand what the problem is. What would your solution to this problem be, then?
Good question,
Good
madam.
question.
Thank you.
I say at the end of the book, I give two scenarios. One fairly detailed of what you could do even now to address this. On the general point, the obvious thing is to do what the public want, which is to massively slow down the flow. Massively slow it down. Recognise that we're not doing a very good job of integration as it stands, and that therefore it's unwise to keep on doing a bad job at these levels. So that is the thing which everything starts from. After that, there's a whole set of things, but one very specific thing I say is, just make sure you choose your allies and friends wisely. Let me give you an example. Somebody I know a little bit in Germany called Hamid Abdul Samad. He's a refugee, he's a German, and he now goes everywhere with German state security protection. Why? Because he talks and calls out the extremists that he sees in the mosques in Berlin. He's horrified to have got to Germany and to found this going on in Germany. Back him. Don't back the people doing the sermons who are bad. Ayaan Hirsi Ali is a dear friend, and I write about it a little bit in the book. The fact that Ayaan Hirsi Ali ended up having to leave the Netherlands. Yes. She believed in the Enlightenment more than Holland now does. She left. No, it shouldn't have been her who left. It should have been the people who were trying to kill her. It should have been the people who called for her murder. They should have been the ones who left.
Yeah. Gentleman down there.
God, I've got a question.
Sorry.
I'm a woman. I'm not.
And we also should
after
have
this
a
gentleman
gallery.
here, and then I'll come straight to you.
We should have a gallery,
Thank you.
exactly.
Very big.
Sorry, I thought it
would
was
like
a
the
voice from
ladies
above.
first.
I didn't.
Being French, I would like the ladies first, if you don't
good
All
mind.
right. What politeness we have here. Your question.
Hi, Douglas, I think your writing is wonderful and that you are wonderful, obviously.
Very kind.
Right, that's enough.
No, go on.
So basically, my boyfriend has read your book. He lives in Germany and he is very worried about a lot of the stuff. And he wanted me to ask you, number one, what is going to happen with the ghastly Jeremy Corbyn? And number two, do you think Trump will get re-elected?
In 10 seconds, please, Murray.
I don't. I've given up making political predictions. Okay. So I won't say about Trump, although I can see how he could be re-elected.
Oh, I could.
Look, Corbyn. It's a nightmare, isn't it? I mean,
Why is it a nightmare? Why is it?
So, look, I have a sectional interest on this, particularly to do with Northern Ireland. I really resent that. I really resent the rewriting of history. That man,
Yes.
for decades, supported people who were slaughtering
Yes.
British citizens and our soldiers. and he pays no political price for this. He
Right,
gets to rewrite.
No, he
gets
pays
to
no political
rewrite
price for a lot of
himself
things,
as
Douglas.
a peacekeeper. As a peacekeeper. For whom was he a peacekeeper? When did he speak to loyalist gangs and honour the people they were killing?
Or indeed Israelis.
Or Israeli. He says that he speaks to Hamas and Hezbollah as friends because he's a peacekeeper. For whom is he a peacekeeper? What is this international body for whom Jeremy Corbyn is the front phalanx peacekeeper who's always sent out? And where are they? I don't want to draw a moral equivalence because I don't think there is one between Hezbollah and its genocidal aims against the Jewish people and some small settler community in the West Bank. But where is the evidence of his outreach to the settler communities? Where is his evidence of his outreach to the Jews in Hebron?
Well, he hasn't. He hasn't. I mean, you're absolutely right.
Why
doesn't it play?
His followers don't care.
Why doesn't it play?
Well, here's the beginning of the reason. Because the left itself decided to destroy the concept of truth decades ago, and we are all paying for it. And they have amazingly turned this around. They now say that Donald Trump is the person who invented the abolition of truth. Donald Trump's abolition of truth is only possible because of a lot of work for decades in the American Academy and in Britain. This idea that facts have only just now become we have for some time ended up in this situation, what Kevin Myers, a fine writer about the Troubles, described as a situation in Northern Ireland in the 70s where truth is whatever you're having yourself. And this is what, as you deal with more of the sewers of the left than I do.
I was kicked out of the party last year, so
yes, to your great credit. But I mean, this is a big problem for our politics. How did this happen? How did this man get there? And why are people not more concerned about it? Why do people not see this man's career in Parliament, his stupidity, his dull-wittedness, his constant banging on about the same stupid, unprovenly wrong refrains?
Because for a lot of the working class voters I know, he's a lot better than Blair.
Right.
And they feel that they've got their party back.
Right. And, of course, the Conservative Party is doing everything it can to get Jeremy Corbyn into power. But I look at this with just horror that this could happen here. And it can make me cry that in this country we no longer care enough about our own recent history. And we don't care enough about what he's doing. I mean, I don't need to say this to you, but I mean, my God. That man and what he's done in his party and is doing now and its attitude towards Jews. How have we got to the situation where anti-Semitism is in this country not just a problem on the left, but a problem of all the leadership on the left?
And largely on the left.
Yeah, I
mean, more on the left than on the right.
If this were happening on the right at the moment, we would all be talking about the return of fascism.
Yes, it's remarkable. Apologies. The very chivalrous gentleman who waited for the lady to speak.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You have debated very efficiently on the Islam as a whole. You haven't, in my opinion, made a difference between the ethnic, and if we speak from England, Britain in particular, we have a different Islam than we are talking about Germany and other France and etc., etc. You talked of Merkel, and I am worried that Merkel, with her million people she has accepted, win the alliance with the French to overcome this situation. We should focus on the ethnic of Islam which we have.
Okay, do you want to answer?
I'm not sure I get that entirely, but...
Well, he's right, though, isn't he, that the Islam which we have in this country is of a different brand, of a different stamp to the Islam.
Well, slightly, but I mean, look, what politician thinks they can dictate that outcome? I mean, I know that politicians love grandiose claims. You know, that if we do this, we can control the temperature in 2100 and so on. But most of them can't do very basic things of governance. I mean, we know that if Jeremy Corbyn came in with a lot of very basic things of governance wouldn't be possible. So who thinks that Jeremy Corbyn or Theresa May should reform Islam? Or Amber Rudd is my favourite. Amber Rudd comes up with these things where she says what is... You know, I would say, how about this? You have a large Muslim community in this country, and on the one hand, Amber Rudd tells them something. On the other, Allah has a different view. Who wins?
It's rather like the wonderful times when Tony Blair and David Cameron would both say, that's nothing to do with Islam, as if they were Quranic scholars.
Yes, yes. My favourite was George Bush after 9/11, who, when he goes to the Islamic Centre he was thought of as the most Islamophobic person in the world for a time. He goes to the Islamic Centre in Washington after 9/11 and quotes the Quran. He says, "This is my favourite translation of this passage," as if he'd spent the night before, you know. So, and well, I find this one more persuasive in the demotic. But
we only have, I think, time for maybe 2 more questions at most.
Should we take them at the same time?
This thing is flashing at me,
Yeah. Sort of saying, stop.
like a bad person coming out of a hedge. Sorry.
How often does that happen where
It
you
happens a
live?
lot to me. I live in Canterbury. The gentleman there, sorry. So is it the people in the centre aren't getting their views heard?
As so often.
As so often is the case.
I'm surprised that so much anti-Semitism going on at university campuses, but even what you might call the higher brow newspapers, such as the Times, for which you write, hardly report on these things.
Yeah.
I'm not surprised that the BBC doesn't report on it, but I am very surprised that newspapers for which you write do not report on things that are going on. We all know they're going on. And it seems to me until we do that, then a lot of the stuff you're talking about at the moment is just going to fly off into the stratosphere if the top newspapers don't write about it.
Sure, I couldn't agree more. But I mean, they accept this as a new normal. Some years ago, there was a man from Hezbollah who came to this country who, among other things beforehand, had said that even a 2-year-old Israeli child was a legitimate target for murder. I remember calling up a journalist who I knew and saying, you know, you've got to report on this. He said, what's he said? I said, even a 2-year-old Israeli. He said, have you got anything better? Have you got anything better on him? The point is that we become used to the horror. And our expectation of what meets our new standard and our new bar is getting ever, ever lower. And one more, he said very quickly. Go on, make it a good one for someone.
No, I'm sorry, I can't.
Can I
a man just appeared there and went like that to me.
Can
So
I finish
either
on one
ISIS
note?
have turned up,
Can I?
or I'm being told. Well, what?
By the way, on a happy note, a gentleman there in France would know this. One of my main opponents in recent years on some of these things, I see Melanie Phillips is in the audience who knows this well, but one of my main opponents in recent years on all these business has been Tariq Ramadan. And
You know he's a Muslim, don't you?
If there's one good piece of news about him, he is currently in a French jail. So I warn my other critics to watch out. This is...
Thank you, Douglas. Thank you all so much, and sorry if you didn't have a chance to ask your questions. Douglas is going to be signing many, many copies of his book, so you could ask them then.
But could I say thank you as well?
Well, indeed, please do.
It's a great pleasure to be here. I haven't been to Jewish Book Week for a few years, but I've always had very happy memories of it when I've been in the audience, and it's a huge honour to be here. I'm very pleased to have your time and for so many of you to turn out, and in another breakout room, I hear. So to all the people in the breakout room as well, thank you.
Oh, yes, yes, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Here you go.